Hi there. In this video I want to talk about the two most important distributions in effective altruism. So effective altruism is a growing international movement of people who want to do the most good using reason, science, evidence. Now there are two important distributions to explain effective altruism. The first distribution is a distribution of income and wealth of people, which explains the altruism part of effective altruism and answers the question why we should do good, why we have to donate more to charities. The second distribution is the distribution of cost effectiveness of projects, which explains the effectiveness part of effective altruism and answers the question how we should do good, how we can donate to more effective charities. Both distributions are very similar, which makes them important. They are very skewed, as we will see. So let's first look at the income distribution. Most likely you belong to the 10% or fewer richest people on earth. Your income and wealth is roughly an order of magnitude, a factor 10, bigger than the world average income. The vast number of people have income levels below the average because a small minority of very rich people, like you, pull the average upwards. Your wealth could even be 2 or more orders of magnitude, a factor 100 or more, higher than the poorest people on earth. In economics, we have the law of decreasing marginal utility, which means that the richer you are, the less value an extra unit of money, an extra euro, has for you. So suppose you find a euro on the street. Your happiness increases a little bit. But if the poorest person finds the same euro, the happiness of that person might increase with a factor 100, bigger than your increase in happiness. It is as if you would find 100 euros. Or in other words, if you donate 1 euro to the poorest person, your decrease in happiness is 100 times smaller than the increase in happiness of that poorest person. Your 1 euro can generate the happiness equivalent of 100 euro for other people. It is as if at a pub you could buy a drink for yourself or you could treat a drink for 100 other people. What would you do? This explains why we might have a duty to donate money. By donating money, total well-being on earth might increase a lot and your well-being will decrease only a little bit. But there's more. We have a strong duty to donate money. A lot of our high income and wealth are the result of so-called economic rent or surplus profits, the bad thing in economics. This is unearned or undeserved income because it is not the result of labor, risk-taking or entrepreneurship. The unearned income, economic rent or surplus revenue, is the income above what is required to generate normal profits. So profits from labor, entrepreneurship and capital investments. In the economy, production factors such as labor, capital and entrepreneurship are compensated, for example, by wages, interest and profits. With such compensation, a production factor would not, without such a compensation, a production factor would not be used. So surplus profit is the additional compensation for a production factor that is higher than necessary to enable or produce this production factor. Compensation for entrepreneurship or capital investments are forms of normal profits, and these profits are just like the wages of labor, earned income. The extra surplus profit is an unearned income because there is no production of a production factor. Now there are various forms of economic rent or surplus profits, such as the Ricardian rent due to the possession and use of scarce natural resources and inherited wealth. This is named after the economist David Ricardo. Another example is the monopoly rent due to a monopoly power by a company. So someone who has scarce natural resources such as land, minerals and fuels can enjoy unearned income from that property. This income is unearned because it is not the result of your labor, your risk-taking or entrepreneurship. Nobody has made those natural resources themselves. And the same goes for the possession of inherited wealth. None of the present generation, people in the present generation, has produced that wealth. These resources already exist and therefore they no longer have to be compensated to serve as a production factor. Okay. When you appropriate a quantity of natural resource such as land, you acquire an exclusivity or a monopoly. This means that someone else cannot use that resource. Natural resources are thus exclusive. They can be used exclusively, and their use or possession excludes the use or possession by others. So much of our income and wealth is based on surplus profits, where we earn an extra income because we have a kind of monopoly on a scarce good that was not produced by the current generation of people. Because of that monopoly, we exclude others from the possession of that scarce resource or that production factor. And that exclusion is what is unfair in the economy. That exclusion is a form of damage we cause to others, especially the poorest people. We basically steal the scarce resources of the poorest people. Because of the exclusion or theft, we should pay the poorest people a compensation or a remuneration fee. Now that compensation can also be understood as a fair distribution of surplus profits. So when you own a scarce resource, this surplus profit is privatized, you get this profit. But the idea is to distribute it, to collectivize this surplus profit. The scarce natural and inherited wealth belongs to everyone, and everyone has an equal right to an equal share of that wealth that is not produced by anyone of the current generation. The surplus profit should therefore be divided fairly. If one appropriates a larger share of that wealth, the excluded people will receive a greater part of the surplus profits as a compensation. And that is a matter of justice, not simply charity. Let me give 3 examples of surplus profits. First, we use and consume many natural raw materials such as fossil fuels and minerals. Those natural resources in the soil belong to everyone, but the amount of available raw materials is limited. And the resources can be distributed equally such that everyone receives a fair share of property rights to those resources. Now, if we use more than our fair share of available raw materials, then we need to buy basically property rights from other people. If we do not, we violate the property rights of others. This is a form of theft for which we have to pay compensation. Now, the oil in our car and the minerals in our cell phones are often stolen goods. Many poor countries are rich in commodities, but corrupt regimes have conquered power there and thus gained control over those raw materials in the soil. And these corrupt regimes appropriate the resources and sell them on the international markets, but the poor populations do not get any income from the commodity sales. Therefore, international trade in oil and minerals is largely a trade in stolen goods, stolen from the poorest people in those countries with corrupt regimes. A basic principle of free trade states that one cannot trade in stolen goods. Now, the effective altruist philosopher Thomas Pogge therefore proposed the idea of a global resources dividend. The revenues from a tax on the appropriation, use or consumption of oil and minerals sold by corrupt regimes can be distributed as a basic income or resource dividends to all people, especially the poorest people. A second example is the theft of emission rights. Now, rich people in developed countries emit too much greenhouse gases, for example. We must restrict emissions to prevent climate change. The atmospheric absorption capacity for greenhouse gases is limited, and the right to emit greenhouse gases is therefore scarce. And what is scarce has an economic value. People who have CO2 emissions that are too high claim too much of those emissions rights for themselves. We can think of an economic system of auction trade of emission permits. So governments put a cap on total emission permits to avoid climate change. Then they sell emission permits to the highest bidders. Everyone who buys a permit can also trade those bought permits. An emission permit is a kind of ownership of some of the Earth's atmospheric processing capacity for greenhouse gases. And there are also other emission rights possible for other substances for which terrestrial ecosystems have limited processing capacity, such as reactive nitrogen compounds or acidifying gases. Now, the government revenues from the auction of emission permits can be distributed again as a universal basic income to everyone. This basically means that everyone has an equal right to this scarce good that the Earth offers us. But in our current economic system, we do not have an auction of emission permits, which means that emission permits are not distributed fairly. How much would an emission permit cost? In order to achieve climate targets, especially to reduce global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade, an efficient emissions trading system would put a price of about 80 euros per ton of CO2, with an annual increase of 5 euro per ton of CO2. So the emission right for 1 ton of CO2 has an economic value of 80 euros, increasing with 5 euros per year. Now, an average person in a rich country emits about 15 tons of CO2 per year. It's 15 tons of CO2 and other equivalent greenhouse gases. So an average person should pay about 1,300 euro for emission permits in 2017. An average human being on Earth emits about 7 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So if an international government would allocate an emission permit revenue as a universal basic income, every person on Earth would receive 600 euros per year. Thus, an average person in a rich country would have to pay 700 euros net because that person emits too many greenhouse gases. The poorest people in the poorest countries are given almost 600 euros a year because they do not produce much greenhouse gases. This actually means that rich people steal emission permits from the poorest people, worth on average 700 euros per year per person, and increasing with 100 euros per year. The rich acquire a part of the scarce CO2 absorption capacity of the atmosphere without paying this scarce good. That 700 euro is a form that we have to give to the poorest people, is a form of compensation that a rich person is obliged to pay to the poorest people. The poorest people are entitled to 600 euros a year. As a third example, we can look at the exclusion of jobs due to closed borders. So our borders of the countries are not fully open, and that means that demand and supply on the global labor market are not in equilibrium due to a policy of closed borders between countries and a restriction on labor migration. Due to the borders, there is a fundamental injustice in the global economy. Labor productivity, so the economic value of a worker that a worker can generate per unit of work, is up to 10 times higher in rich countries than in poorest countries. And this means that someone in a rich country acquires up to 10 times more purchasing power than a similar person in a poor country who is equally skilled, trained, talented, motivated, and does the same job, equally long, risky and heavy. Wages in the rich countries can be 10 times higher for the same work than in the poorest countries. This is the so-called place premium. Where you are born, in which country you're born, strongly determines how much you earn. This huge wage gap in the global economic system is a form of global apartheid. Foreigners are excluded from having a job in the country. And that exclusion is similar to the exclusion due to the possession of natural resources. Because the exclusion of foreigners, the global labor market is not in equilibrium, and this means workers in the rich countries benefit from a surplus profits due to the higher wages. That exclusion is a form of damage, because by this exclusion we limit the job opportunities of the foreigners. It's like I prevent you from working with somebody else. So you want to go to a company for work, and I prevent you from entering at the gates of that company, even when the employer of that company is willing to hire you. That is basically what countries do. Governments do not own the companies, but they prevent some people from working at those companies. Because of this exclusion, the labor market is not in equilibrium, and in the poor countries the demand for work is greater than the supply. As a result, wages are pushed down in the poor countries. A policy of closed borders thus harms the poor populations. The poor populations are paid wages that are too low. So increasing, for example, labor mobility will have a very strong positive effect on the global economy. It will be a win-win situation for both the rich countries, the poor countries, and the people who migrate. Now there are two options then. Either we open the borders for foreign workers, or we pay those foreigners compensation. And that compensation is a remuneration fee that the job owner in a rich country has to pay, has a duty to pay, to the excluded persons who are at least as capable of working, but who are prevented to work in the rich country. This is comparable to a rich owner of natural resources who has more commodities than the fair share and has to pay compensation for the poorest people who have too little resources. So what does this all mean? Basically, we have to pay a compensation fee to the poorest people due to our unearned surplus profits from economic rent on natural resources in Article 12, emission permits and jobs. And this surplus profits partly explains why people in the rich country earn 10 times more income. Now the total value that we have to give to the poorest people is probably more than 1,000 euros per year, probably more than 5 or 10% of our income if we add up all those unearned profits. Now we can donate this money to charities that help the poorest people. An obvious, effective charity recommended by the most credible charity evaluator, GiveWell, is the organization Give Directly, which distributes unconditional cash transfers to the poorest families in Kenya, Uganda and Rwanda. So these cash transfers, like those of Give Directly, have arguably the strongest existing evidence base among anti-poverty tools. So they are very effective in terms of poverty reduction. Now let's move to the second distribution of cost effectiveness of projects. For many projects and campaigns or interventions, measuring the impact, the positive impact that the project does, is not possible. But what if we would measure the impact or cost effectiveness of the measurable projects? So this has been done in the fields of, for example, human health, poverty relief and education. And the impact or cost effectiveness of health interventions can be measured, for example, in terms of the increase of quality adjusted life years per euro donated. Now what is the result? The result was basically shocking. We see again a very skewed distribution. That means a small minority of the measurable projects, less than 10%, have a cost effectiveness more than 10 times higher than the average project. The vast majority of projects have a cost effectiveness below average. So the small minority of highly effective projects raise up this average. Some highly effective interventions are more than 2 orders of magnitude effective, more effective than the least effective interventions. For example, the cost to train a guide dog to help one blind person for 10 years is equivalent to the cost to prevent blindness for 1,000 people in Africa by paying for very cheap surgeries to reverse the effects of trachoma, an eyelid infection. So this skewed distribution is similar to the income distribution and has far-reaching consequences. Knowledge about this cost-effectiveness distribution basically kick-started the effective altruism movement about a decade ago. As a first consequence, we realize that by selecting the most effective projects or donating to the most effective charities can increase the amount of good that we do with more than a factor 10. Even someone who donates only 100 euros to a highly effective charity can do more good than someone who donates 1000 euro. Another consequence is that donating to a charity that focuses on a few highly effective projects is better than donating to a well-known big organization that has a lot of projects with unmeasured impacts. If an organization has many projects randomly chosen, a vast majority of those projects will likely have a cost effectiveness below average. A project that has proven high cost effectiveness is probably more effective than a random project with unknown or unmeasured cost effectiveness. So that's why it's better to focus on organizations that focus on highly cost-effective projects instead of donating to big charities. A third counterintuitive implication of this skewed distribution is that fundraising for a charity with a low cost effectiveness might be harmful. Fundraising increases the total donations a little bit, but the biggest effect of fundraising is a shift in donations. People shift their donations away from other organizations and to your organization. So if your organization focuses on a few projects that are not so cost effective, the cost effectiveness of that organization can easily become lower than the average. And that means you shift donations away from other organizations that have an average effectiveness and towards an organization with a below average effectiveness. And as a result, fundraising for that organization will decrease the total amount of good done in the world. So counterintuitively, you can say some kinds of fundraising for charities can be really harmful in the sense that doing nothing, sitting at a bar, drinking a beer, for example, will do more good than fundraising. The world where you do nothing, where you sit in a bar, is a world where more good is done than the world where you actively fundraise for money. So that concludes this video about the two most important distributions that we should know. The income distribution, which explains why we have a duty to donate a substantial part of our income to the poorest people. And then secondly, the cost effectiveness distribution, which says that we have a duty to select the most cost effective charities. Thank you for watching.